Welcome back to the Absolute Podcast. This episode is episode 30. It's definitely not episode 32, and it's definitely not episode 58 or any other episode. Episode 30. Today's episode is with Micheal Leger. He is an oyster farmer. I think he owns part of an oyster business as well. He's like a part owner. Basically, what we talked about was purely just oyster farming. It's super interesting. We learned about the business side of it, the harvesting side, the kind of the species of it, a little bit of history of it, and just like things to look out for, how to do it, just a bunch of stuff about it. We didn't veer off the topic at all. We didn't discuss anything else. It was primarily just oyster farming, and it's super interesting. So I recommend to go give it a listen. Anyways, thank you, Micheal. You're amazing. I can't wait to see you this summer. You're an extremely awesome dude. And extremely intelligent, by the way. He really is a smart guy. Even though we didn't veer off anything other than oyster farming, he's a really awesome guy and smart guy. So, anywho, enjoyed the episode. Yeah, we're just gonna jump into it like that. Okay, thank you. Alright, starting off, today's episode is sponsored by Piccadilly Coffee. Go on the website, piccadillycoffee.ca, use the promo code MichealJones20, MichealJones20 for 20% off all your purchases. Go to Piccadilly Coffee, get yourself bags of coffee just like this, and use the code MichealJones20 for 20% off. How's that, Micheal? Not bad?
Too bad I didn't know about that when I went there.
Yeah, seriously. I think it's just for the online website, though. So you just got to order. Anywho.
Well, I'm happy you've made it to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. We did have a little bit of a hiccup, yeah. We basically spent an hour just trying to get this set up with so many issues.
Well, really, the lesson to be learned is that MacBook got set aside and Microsoft Windows got used.
Yeah, Microsoft Windows won.
Yeah.
Against Apple.
Yeah.
It's an issue. So, some things we discussed while we were off camera was we found out that there are 300 churches on Prince Edward Island. And there's also something about the sun and the moon. What did you say?
I forget now. The sun loses a lot of mass every second. And the Earth is heavy.
Yep. Earth is heavy. All right, Micheal. You're an oyster farmer.
Yep.
Fully oyster farmer.
Yep.
You do that, so that's an all-around year thing?
Well, the ice takes us out of commission in the fall and then puts us, when the ice leaves, we're back on the water. So
are you able to sustain yourself for a few months? No problem?
Yep.
Nice.
It's a seasonal industry, and then in the winter you do maintenance and equipment repair, and usually build a bit of a new equipment every year. And so we're basically on the water till late October to early mid-April-ish. Mid-April. Okay. We're back on the water.
Cool. So when you're working all day, like it's all summer, right?
Yep.
And then people enjoy their oysters in the winter type thing?
Yeah.
But oysters probably last until the summer too.
Well, oysters hibernate down to a certain temperature, so the harvest season traditionally has been in the fall. So everyone harvests all fall. And then the processors all get a great big stockpile, fill their freezers or their reefers. It's not freezing, but it's below freeze. The oysters aren't going to freeze, but they're going to hibernate. And then once those are all full, they put them in the water under the ice, and then they GPS mark everything, and they go out all winter. Once the ice makes, they go out and they cut holes in the ice because they have GPS. They know exactly where everything is. They cut a hole, and they have like a big A-frame on skids that they pull behind a skidoo or tracked four-wheel or whatever, drive over the hole and just winch it up. And that's how they sustain all winter. Now, this year was a bit of a challenge because there wasn't as much ice. So some spots down east were using boats most of the winter to go get stuff, which is crazy. But then other spots more in the middle of the island, there wasn't enough ice. So if there's not enough ice for a four-wheeler, now of course if you put an A-frame over a hole in the ice and you lift 2,000 pounds, well, you need a lot of ice to support that weight. So you need enough ice to be safe. But if there's only an inch of ice or 2 inches of ice, you won't be able to take a boat out because you won't be able to break the ice. So there's that kind of middle awkward stage. But usually, right now, they're all starting to run out of oysters. Because, like, Valentine's Day, or, like, up to Valentine's Day, people are buying a lot of oysters.
Yep.
And then they're running out of oysters now. And then as soon as we raise everything in a month, in a month we'll be on the water. We'll start getting calls from processors trying to buy more oysters, stock back up, just to keep them afloat. Because, like any market, if you have a customer for 10 years and then you go 6 months where you can't fill their needs, and they go elsewhere to fill their needs, chances are they won't come back. They'll just stick with what they found. So processors try really hard to... So if the processor I sell to runs out of oysters, he'll call his competitor and buy oysters from his competitor and sell them just to keep, so the margins go down, but just keep those customers. So once we get on the water, we'll start getting calls. Hey, do you have oysters ready? Where, but the real harvest is the fall, like August. Late August, September, October.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you're putting cages out, well, how much water do you own for your?
So we're three guys that own leases together that work together, and then we have one permanent employee, and the three of us together combine our leases, we own, like our farms, 20 acres.
20 acres.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but on water it seems bigger than, like, if you look at a 20-acre field,
right,
and then look at a 20-acre body of water,
and you got to go through all that water. It's a big difference.
Yeah, and it's not perfectly transferable, like the concept.
Yeah, and you're always close to the coast.
Yeah,
like it's always 20 acres out from the coast, kind of thing.
No,
like not out from the coast,
and
but
it's not like at your typical beach. Well, some spots are like, there are some leases that are in very open areas, like you talk about Malpeg Bay off of Summerside. It's a great big bay, and there's just leases in the bay, but they end up with problems with, like, wind and storms and everything, because, like, the wind has a longer runway and they get bigger waves and more damage. But then we're actually in Foxley River, which all the river, like, PI doesn't have any mountains, obviously. So we don't have freshwater rivers. Like, freshwater rivers anywhere else start in the mountains, and then, like, a whole bunch of springs or glaciers or whatever, and it trickles down, right? But then PI doesn't have that, so any inland run has tidal water coming in and out. So the farther up you go, you're just plugging in the Microsoft there.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
The farther in you go on all these inland rivers, you'll come to streams, but you don't have true freshwater rivers.
Okay.
Right? You have freshwater streams, and then every river on PEI, the tidal, like the salt tidal water comes in. So if you go to Bonshaw, where you're walking along the river, it looks like a freshwater river, but then on high tide and low tide, like, the water goes up and down, not like a normal river in New Brunswick, right? How did I get on that? Oh, so all the leases, like the farm, we call them leases, but all the oyster farms on PEI are mostly all in inland rivers that are tidal.
Okay.
So we're not actually out, like, on the beach.
On the edge of the water.
Like what you would call the beach. You go...
Like, you're not on the edge of the island the whole way around, basically. Yeah.
Like, we're in Fox River, so you have Alberton, and the water comes in inland in Alberton. There's Cascampeg Bay, and then there's Mill River, and then there's Fox River off of Cascampeg Bay, and then there's the Conway Narrows. There's all these different bodies of water, but it's all salt.
Yeah. So would the best way to explain that, I guess, from an audio perspective or trying to visualize it, think of like where lobster fishermen kind of come into,
Yeah.
and you'd be kind of farther down the
So
way.
lobster fishermen come in like inland into like natural harbors. Back in the day, there were just natural harbors where they could get their boats in, throw an anchor over. But now they've built like harbors in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then oyster farms are just farther up those waterways.
Kind of where you don't have to worry about people traveling through so much. Yeah.
So then with oyster farming, you end up where water depth is important. If you have too much water depth, it's not good.
Yeah, I was wondering, but you're able to walk out the whole way,
No.
right? You're not.
Not able to. Where the actual farming takes place, you can't. It's too deep to walk.
Oh.
So there's fishing, and in the oyster fishing areas, the perfect water depth maybe on a high tide would be 6, 7, 8 feet on a high tide, right? And then a low tide, you'd have 2 feet something, and that's perfect for fishing. So if people have been on the island before, they would see in the spring and the fall, they'd see people out on little boats, dories they call them, standing on the bow of the boat with like a big pair of salad tongs scraping the bottom.
Yeah.
So it's just a big pair of salad tongs, and they're scraping the sand and pulling up and seeing what's in it. Where we farm, so we have equipment, anchors, lines, and cages floating on the surface. And you need enough water so that when the winter comes, you can sink everything to the bottom, and the ice can make on top, and the ice doesn't crush your equipment.
Right.
Because the problem you get when like 2015, there was a lot of ice. There was a lot of snow. There was a lot of ice because snow pushes the ice down, makes ice.
Yep.
2015, we ended up with 2015, we had a lot of ice, and we actually had some damage because there was too much ice, and there was about 2.5 feet of ice, and then there was like decade low tides, like the lowest tides of the decade. So in the wintertime, if you have a cage that's about the height of this bench, which is 1.5 feet, so if you set the cage down on the ocean floor, it's 1.5 feet tall, and then you have 4 feet of water above it, and then you have 2 feet of ice, so the ice displaces the water, right? You have 2 feet of ice, and then a really, really low tide that's abnormally low. Well, the ice will sit on your cages, and the ice will just, like, the cages are no match for the ice, right? So the ice will just collapse your cages.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Is that much weight?
Oh, yeah. Like, well, have you ever
What's a cage made out of, though?
Like lobster wire. Or aluminum rod, like it's two different
so it's
ways.
not super durable. It's
no,
not like...
and aluminum rod, like some are made, like the more durable ones are made of aluminum rod. So it's just a frame. They can hold like what we call oyster bags, and then they're just like a plastic bag that's about 16 inches by 3 feet by 4 inches thick, and there's 6 of those. So if you just picture, like a sturdy plastic cage that's like 2 inches thick, 16 inches wide, 3 feet long, and then you have a cage that 6 of those fits into, and each of those have oysters in them, and the cage just has to hold those, and then there's pontoons, like plastic floats that float that at the surface all summer. And when you sink that and the ice sits on that, like if you've ever lifted a bag of peas that have been in the freezer, like that's pretty heavy. Like frozen water, well, water's heavy, but like ice is like a cage is no match for ice whatsoever, right? So water depth was the original question. You need enough water depth so that when you get a lot of ice and really low tides, it doesn't sit on your equipment. But then if you have too much water depth, you have to sink everything. So we have dry suits. And in the come the fall, you get in the water's really cold, but you have dry suits, so you're not cold. Yeah. You take the covers off. There's covers on the end of these floats. Take the covers off, and you guide the cage to the bottom. And if it's too deep, you need tanks.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because and sometimes like they go down wrong. You have to swim down because if you set them, if you picture like a pontoon boat, can you picture a pontoon boat?
Oh yeah.
You picture a pontoon boat that's just floating at the marina. Well, the seating area is all out of the water. But then if you flip that pontoon boat, you just see the pontoon sticking out of the water.
Yeah.
Well, when the oysters are feeding, you have that pontoon boat flipped upside down. So imagine that the oysters are where all the seats are.
Yeah.
The pontoon boat, and then the floats are sticking out of the
It's a really
water.
good analogy, actually.
Yeah. So then, if you're sinking that, you don't want to set the oysters down in the mud because the weight of the cage itself will push them into the mud and kill a bunch of the oysters because they even though they're hibernating, they need to freshen the water.
Right?
Yeah. So all the cages, like the pontoon boat, is flipped. The pontoons are sticking out of the ground. The floats of the boat, but it's just a cage. So and for the record, it's not as big as a pontoon boat. Like it's not near as big as a pontoon boat. But then you're in the water with the dry suit, and you take the covers off, and then in the water you have to grab onto the cage, flip it, and guide it down on the pontoons. So you got to flip it and set it down. That way the pontoons, the floats, hold the oysters off the mud.
That's cool.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
So
because I always wondered when you said flipping it, I was like, are half of them underneath still when you flip it, and then like they're drying out the top? You know what I mean? When you flip it the other way, but no, I understand what you mean now.
So then if you sink that and there's too much water and you make a mistake and you get it crooked, well, you want to go down and adjust it. One part of our farm, the water is like 8-9 feet deep, and I'm not a great swimmer, and the dry suits are very floaty. Like they want to float,
kind of lift you up.
Yeah. So if you're sinking cages and it goes down crooked, and then you got to swim down, so you're fighting against the dry suit to let you get down there, and then once you get down there, you need to grab it and muscle it to turn it. If you have too much water, you can't do that. Especially without tanks. So
are you like deep diving that stuff, like holding your breath type thing?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's the challenge, right? Like at 8 feet, it's really a challenge to fix those cages and get up. Like by the time you get up, you're having a panic attack. It's like,
you're fighting against time.
Yeah. Well, actually, often when it happens in that deep of water, it takes you 2 or 3 attempts. Like you go down.
Try to adjust it a little bit, go back up.
Correct.
So you're an Olympic swimmer at this point. So you're an Olympic swimmer at this point.
I am not. I'm not a good swimmer. I'm not a good swimmer at all. But wetsuits and dry suits make a good swimmer already because you just learn to use your flippers. Yeah. And you can't, like in a dry suit, you can't swim fast anyway because they're big and bulky.
I did not know that you were dealing with going underwater and stuff.
Yeah.
It varies depending on your location too, right? Like some people, because I watched a video and the guys were just all walked out.
Yeah.
And that was no issue. And they just walked up and just...
People tried to do that technique in the past around here, but they ended up, when you do that, you have everything in shallow water on racks. Yeah. Well, you get one windy storm and it blows everything on the beach. So then after one storm, you have to haul everything out. But we have 5/8 lines, 5/8 rope, run 350 feet long.
And is that all anchored too?
So there's long lines. It's a bit... I always struggle to explain it properly because people don't have a proper concept of what happens underwater. So they see stuff floating on top.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
But to translate what you see on top to what's going on under the water is hard. But if you were on land and you just ran a bunch of 350 feet ropes straight, and then go over 25 feet and run another one, and go over 25 feet and run another one, and then you end up with like a grid, right? And then at the end, so that's how it is in the water, but that rope's under the water. Yeah. And at the end of each of these ropes, on both ends, you have anchors.
Yeah. So it's kind of just swaying in the middle a little bit like that.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So you have screw anchors, they drive like 10 feet into the mud. And then off of these lines, there's two ropes come up, and one cage is fastened to those 2 ropes. So from both ends, so the cage doesn't spin around. So you have 2 ropes that come up, one cage, 2 ropes that come up, one cage, 2 ropes that come up, one cage, 2 ropes that come up, right? And we have 3,000 cages. Wow. So we're not the biggest farm around. We're not the smallest, but we're not the biggest, right?
You got some competitors that you got to beat out.
I
If
don't.
you're not worried about it.
Yeah, I'm not worried. Like we're all. It's a pretty friendly industry, and everyone
Okay.
helps each other quite a
Yeah.
bit. Like there's no.
Kind
The
of more of a community type thing.
Well, at this point, there's not much. Well, through COVID, there was more difficulty selling, but apart from COVID, there wasn't much difficulty selling oysters.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as people aren't having a hard time moving their product, you won't have any animosity, because what would the animosity be about?
Right.
Right? Like there's no. Now there's personality issues, like there's people who don't get along, but beyond that,
Yeah.
people are pretty friendly.
Well, it's cool that you're talking about that kind of thing, because I was wondering, what people don't realize is it takes 2 years to be able to finally harvest your oysters, right?
Well, 2 years if you're in the perfect environment.
Oh, okay. So what is your environment a little more harsh?
No,
Or-
Fox River, where we are, you can harvest some of them after 2 years. But like just the overachievers, but you're not going to be maybe 25% of your crop, maybe at 2 years. Most of them will be after 3 years.
Okay.
And then
I looked at that. Like for wild oysters, it's normal to be fully grown pretty much in 3 years. But they said when you're farming, it's like 2 years you can get them grown.
Because on the top of the water is more food, and the water is warmer. So the oysters on the bottom stay dormant longer and go dormant sooner,
Really?
right? Because the bottom, so the sun doesn't affect the bottom as much. Plus, cold goes down.
Mm-hmm.
So for those two reasons, the bottom is always colder. So even in the summer when you're swimming and the water's 22 degrees in the rivers, you dive to the bottom and you get a chill,
Yeah.
even in 8 feet of
It's
water.
just like a little layer.
Yeah.
Just a layer down, yeah.
But so after 3 years, you can bang on most of your crop going after 3 years, but then you have what we call as rebag. Like ones that are too small, you put back out, and they'll go 4 years.
I was going to ask you how you can tell if they're big. They actually grow in size?
Yeah.
And is there like a diagram that you're like, all right, this is...
There's a percentage, but now we used to grade by hand, and it was the worst job you've ever done in the world.
Because you're just sorting constantly?
Yeah, you're standing over a table, you're a little bent over.
Ugh, yeah,
You
I know what
have-
you mean.
You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sizes, and you got to pick up every oyster and make there's measures you can use, and you always have a measure there to train your brain.
Yep.
But you pick up every oyster and you need to make a decision on every oyster and throw it into a bin, throw it into a bin, throw it into a bin. And I've never had back trouble like I did when I graded oysters by hand. I hated it. And
You almost need...
it takes a long time to get good at it. Like it took me...
Is that still the process?
No, so now they use machines. So so we clean all our oysters, or at least make sure they're clean, because like barnacles will grow on them and all that. Mussels will grow in amongst them. Other oysters will stick to oysters, and you got to make sure every oyster is individual.
Yeah.
And then you ship that to the processor. Now all the processors have machines that the oysters go over a belt.
And if they're
And there's
big enough?
there's a series of singulators. There's a series of machines that takes bulk oysters that are just in a big pile, and then puts it on a conveyor and then separates them.
Oh, cool.
And then it goes through a little box, and in the little box is a camera that takes a picture from the side and a camera that takes a picture from the top, and it measures the depth, and from the top it measures width to length ratio.
Cool.
And if it's like 70% or something like that, I'm not sure what every processor is kind of different. So they say like a big oyster should be at least a third as wide as it is long, or maybe 40% as wide as it is long. And then it goes further, and then there's a series of gates, or some have like pressure, like compressor, like air, pressured air, compressed air. And it shoots it into different boxes based on that picture. And they can grade like a ridiculous amount of oysters in a day, compared to like it used to be. If I graded 10,000 pieces in a day, that was like a unbelievable day.
Yeah.
But those machines can do that in a matter of hours.
Right.
Plus, they're more accurate.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
humans,
They don't make decisions, right? They just
no,
they just do.
based on the coordinates that you punch in.
Mm-hmm.
So that has helped a lot because that was the part I hated the most of the industry was
Yeah.
grading.
It's just tedious work.
Tedious.
At the end of the day.
Anyway, some bodies of water, the bigger body of water you're in, and the least streams, the least like freshwater streams. So every time it rains, it puts food in the water.
Mm-hmm.
Every time there's a big wind, it riles up food and puts
Yeah.
food in the water.
That's a big thing too, right? Your crop doesn't. You don't need feed.
No,
You don't need feed. It's all natural.
correct.
So that saves cost in a farming standpoint, I guess.
Yeah.
A growing standpoint.
Correct. And then some bodies of water, it's funny because if you look at water and you say that water is dirty, I can't see the bottom, and there's 6 feet of water and I can barely see the bottom, you say it's dirty.
Mm-hmm.
That's where oysters want to be.
Really.
Yeah, if you're somewhere and the water's clear and you can see the bottom, there's no food in the water.
Right.
So an
Is it
environment,
because that's basically filtered out?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So, you think about fish kills, like when you get a whole bunch of rain and then a bunch of fish die.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, like oysters can die if it's really intense for a real long time, but typically oysters will thrive in that environment
Wow.
because it's just like an abundance of food. But then other places that have more water flow and like the water's clear, bigger bays, bigger open bays, the oysters can actually take 5-6 years to get to market
Wow.
because they just don't have the food.
Right.
Right.
So I'm curious on how do you organize your cages? So you have 3,000 cages. How do you organize what's good and what's not good to pick from and choose? Like, do you have them laid out and tagged or whatever? That I don't know how the system
Well, we have all
works
the
at
lines numbered, so each line is numbered.
Okay.
In
How
a
many
perfect-
lines would you have?
60
60
between
lines?
those 3 farms that we all
Okay,
work
yeah.
together, right?
So do you
um,
cover a certain area? So you're like 1/3 of the area, and that's all.
A
you
bit
worry
more than 1/3.
about? Okay.
So each line is individual. In a perfect world, each line, like one line, this is all 2-year large, and this is all 2-year small, and this is all 1-year large, and this is all.
Okay.
In a perfect world, and actually in a perfect world, you could say the first 10 lines is all the same, but that never happens. At least not with us.
Is that because it's just such a what's that word? An inconsistent rate of growth between the oysters? So it naturally just gets mixed up for.
No, not necessarily. The main issue is that usually you sell a couple of lines, and you sell them for different reasons. Like maybe this one's a bit dirty. Okay, we need to deal with that, so we take it in, we clean it up, we ship it. But maybe this one over here was more ready. The oysters were bigger, but they weren't dirty. And these here, if we left them, they would have gotten worse. So we just moved them. So then, like, and you end up with like a disorganized system. But we have documentation of what's in every line, so it's not a problem.
Oh, you would know, yeah.
But then you end up with spat, we call it. So it's seed, like babies, and they're anywhere from the size of your pinky to the size of your thumb, like when they're starting out. So they set, like the spat sets in June. We collect that, put it in bags with really small holes, right?
Yeah.
Because they're really small. If you put them in bags with big holes, they'll fall out. And because they're really small, you can put a coffee cup worth in a bag, and you look at it and you say there's nothing in there. But if you don't want to put a lot because they grow really fast when they're that small, and if you left them there within a year, they pretty near fill the bag, right? So then when they're really small, you put a coffee cup worth and you might have 1,500 oysters in that coffee cup.
Wow.
Right? And after a year, you dump that, you put it over a shaker sizer. So have you ever seen a combine?
Yep. Oh,
The
yeah.
combine cuts the grain, brings it up, and shakes vigorously, and it separates the content, right? So inside a combine, you don't see it, but there's screens that shake, and some stuff falls through, some stuff goes up. Well, oysters, we have the same concept. We have shakers, and there's multiple screens The top has bigger holes, and then smaller holes, and the smaller holes, and the smaller holes. And that it's on an angle. Mm-hmm. So those oysters, those 1,500 in a bag, and 6 bags in a cage, that's a lot of oysters. You dump it all. You put it over that shaker, and it shakes. The bigger stuff comes out on top. The middle stuff comes out, and you keep all that. Yeah. And then the bottoms, you depending on your outlook, you might keep it, you might sell it, or you might throw it out. But that's just a decision you make. So you're sizing it. You're separating it into 3 categories. But then on top of it, you're picking the top layer, because the bigger oysters tends to be where you'll get the doubles. So you get 2 oysters growing together.
Is that a good thing?
No.
Oh.
Because oysters are all about quality. All about like appearance. Oh, okay. So while that's going over that shaker, you have 3 guys or 4 guys, whatever, standing there and just picking as many of the doubles as they see. Mm-hmm. And, it takes a bit of time, but it's worth doing, because then it cleans up your end result. Like your end result, you're taking it, you're culling it already, right?
So is that a spreadable thing, a double oyster? Like, is that...
Oh yeah, you can. We collect it, like we gather them and throw them in pans and just dump them on the bottom. Okay. And like they'll survive. Some of them will survive on the bottom, and you could fish them down the road. So then you do that. So now you have 3 sizes that you're keeping, or potentially, like, depends. Some people sell the large because there's more money. Like, the bigger an oyster is, the more room it takes to hold. And depending on your program, maybe you'll sell some of large, maybe you'll whatever. So then we usually keep all 3 sizes, at least for the first year. So then you head 1,500 oysters. Now you split that into 4 sizes. You threw the doubles away. So now you have 3 sizes.
Large, medium, small.
Large, medium, small. And then you'll bag them individually, and you might put 400 of the large. So you were at 1,500. Mm-hmm. You might put 400 of the large in one bag, or like one line, each bag. And then you might do the same, or maybe 600 of the mediums, and then maybe 1,000 of the smalls, right? So now there's still too much in a bag, but you went from 15 and then organized it, culled, and then maybe 6 months later, maybe the next spring, you take all those again and you split down the large again to their final amounts. Maybe 200, 180, some people, 225, some people. And then once you have 185 or 200, 220 of the large in a bag, or even of the smalls in a bag, you just wait. Okay. You're waiting, and then that's where they're going to get harvested, hopefully, right? Yeah. So that's the grow out amount. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. And a big part of our job is air drying. So if you've ever been at the harbor, or at the beach for that matter, like a rocky beach, where you see a whole bunch of barnacles, like on the side of the harbor, there's just, when the tide's low, there's just barnacles and mussels and everything. Well, that's because oysters, barnacles, mussels, all those water creatures, they release eggs, they release sperm in the water column, and mixes, and then just sticks to anything, right? You can keep going. It just sticks to everything, so it'll also stick to your equipment. Oh, okay. So it'll stick to all your equipment, and that needs to be dried and killed.
Do you know many people that we'll just start with a new question, I guess, sorry. Do you know many people that do oyster gardening, like themselves, or farming? Like they just do a small cage for themselves?
Yeah.
Is that common? Around here, I guess?
Well, around here, all the rivers have oysters in them. So you could just walk on the beach, walk out, and you can find them if you want them.
And it's free?
Yeah.
To do that?
Like, you're allowed, like, I forget how much, but you're allowed a certain amount per person per day.
Poundage-wise, or?
No, just individual pieces.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you think oyster is such a delicacy? Do you know that reason?
No, I don't.
I don't either.
It
always seemed like a fancier type food, or a...
But the funny thing is, though, you go to Toronto, say, and you go to Oyster Bar and you watch people eat, and it's high-end people who eat them, because high-end people who can afford them. But you stay on PI here, the people who like them are your typical old fella who blue-collar worker his whole life, worked in the woods his whole life, and he just loves them. And he doesn't pay for them, he just goes and gets them.
Nice.
right?
Yeah.
But there's some to say about like exotic foods, right? Like foods that are rare and limited, like
Less
mussels.
resourced, yeah.
Like mussels, like I was saying, if you go to a harbor, you'll see mussels up and down. Like mussels grow anywhere in any environment, almost, and uniform, right? They'll grow, like you'll have a clump that big, and like mussels are like spiders, they'll web together.
Oh, really?
Like they shoot a web. Yeah.
Really?
So if you took a mussel and threw him in the water,
he would eventually
find some to web to. They throw a web.
And do
So
they reproduce like that too?
well, they attach to each other. So if you had 10 mussels, after a year, you'd have, if you looked at it really close, you'd see a bunch of tiny ones, but they weren't babies from those specific ones. They were just in the water column, and they stick. Mussels are attracted to mussels, and it must be a good surface for them to stick to.
Yeah.
But mussels don't actually stick to each other. Like, they just stitch to each other.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Oysters will stick to each other.
Oh, okay.
Like, an oyster will stick to this piece of wood, and you'll have to chip him off. Like, he'll grow in, like glue himself in.
The shell sticks or the
shell sticks.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Very interesting.
and oysters grow based on their environment. So oysters will grow long and skinny, or wide and thick, or like oysters will grow in 1,000 different ways. But if you have an oyster that is 1 inch wide and 6 inches long, he's worth nothing, essentially.
Yeah, you want a fat, like palm hand
Correct.
type. Like the size of your hand, you want an oyster like that.
Yeah, like round.
To be able to cup it,
Yeah.
right?
So oysters are really fussy about their growing environment. That's why they're more exotic. Like mussels are sort of exotic, right? But you see them eaten a lot more, and they're a lot cheaper to buy. But oysters, because they're so hard to grow and are more exotic, like that just adds to the whole mystique or whatever.
Yeah.
And they're considered like a high protein food, or I'm told.
Nutrient food, yeah.
So that whole pontoon boat thing I was talking about earlier, like every 2 weeks at least, we have to take that pontoon boat, take that cage and flip it, and expose all the oysters to the air. Because older oysters take, depending on the time of year, anywhere between 2 days and a week to die out of the water. So you expose everything to the air, and to let the air kill all the microscopic stuff.
Okay.
Kill the mussels that are on there, they're microscopic. Kill the barnacles that are on there. Kill the tunicates. Kill all the different, and other oysters as well. Because if you let a bunch of stuff stick to it, it'll be very difficult to clean, and you'll kill your quality. And your quality will just be garbage, and then your oysters will be worth. Like you're farming oysters, but your oysters will be worth the value of fished oysters.
Oh, okay.
Where fished oysters tend not to be as nice, because like they grow on the bottom, and often they're in mud, so they'll have one little lip sticking out of the mud trying to get water flow, right?
okay.
So then it'll just keep growing in that little, So, yeah.
Cool.
But hopefully this summer, if you come out, I can show, like, I find it tough to explain and to make the explanation interesting, because it's a lot of stuff that maybe, I'm assuming, must not be super easily understood for people who don't have any concept of it, right?
Like they're trying to visualize something that they have no idea what to even think about, which is tough, and which is why speaking is really hard to make a visual effect to your voice to explain the thing. Yeah. So,
and when I talk, I describe, like, when I'm French, so when I talk, I use my hands, but then in a recording, you
don't,
like, I'm making the shape of an oyster, but the recording.
So when I said, like, in your palm, like a cup in the palm, like,
hopefully
people can understand that kind of. Is it would it be difficult to start an oyster business from scratch?
Yes. So leases were issued years ago for free. Just like lobster licenses, they were issued for free back in the day. But they don't, apart from a few select places, I'm assuming, they don't issue them anymore. So you can't go out and just say, this piece of water I want to lease. Mm-hmm. So then you need to buy an existing lease. So it's a lease that the crown gives you, like the crown, like the queen or the king, whatever. Mm-hmm. And you get a paper, the majesty, the queen, and these coordinates, and you have the right to oysters
Yeah.
and bar clams, say. Well, then some leases only have a foot of water on low tide. And some leases are right on the outside where on a north wind there's 10-foot swells.
Mm-hmm.
And some leases are in perfect environments. So all leases aren't created equal.
Yep.
Right? So if you want to get into it, you need to go find someone who's selling a lease that is in an ideal situation or close to ideal or workable for your plans. But the problem being is that in the last 10 years, like I got into this about 10 years ago, right before the market like absolutely exploded.
Oh, really?
So the value of ground has like quadrupled, right? So it's hardly affordable to get into it now. So right now you're getting a lot of bigger guys who are buying out smaller guys.
Yeah.
And they're just getting bigger, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like those guys are ambitious and they have big crews and they're paying their crews well. So like, you know, you can say what you will about capitalism, but it allows, you know, it's giving people jobs.
Right.
And it would stand to reason that if you have your own lease and you can afford to buy somebody else out, well, you must be managing yours pretty good. So hopefully, like as you grow, it'll still be efficient and still be good for the economy on the island, right? The economy in fishing in general on PEI has exploded, like lobster, mussels, and oysters in the last 10 years. So it's very difficult to get into.
PEI's turned into such a tourist place.
Yeah.
Where just people come for that stuff. So
yeah.
It's just, you get millions of people every summer.
Hopefully.
And then nobody in the nobody in the winter.
Yeah, who wants to come to PEI in the winter?
How long do you think oysters have been around in this world?
Oh, I don't know.
No guess at all?
No guess at all.
They say they've been around for like almost 200 million years.
That's what they claim.
But it's a type of fossil almost, right? Like,
well, they're a pretty simple animal. Like, I don't know.
They can live in cold and hot, so
they can survive in cold. Yeah, but if it's too cold, they can't feed.
Oh,
if it's too hot,
because they won't open up, right? Or
yeah,
what?
like if it's too cold, there's typically not enough food in the water when it's really, really cold. And then when it's too hot, they go dormant for some reason when it's really hot, like 25, 28 degrees.
Okay.
Yeah.
You would never have to worry about that, though, eh? Not being...
The farther upriver you go, like one of the guys I work with who has a lease, his lease can get to a place where the water's too hot.
Really? Just because it's getting more shallow as you go.
Yeah, and it, like... we're in a bay, but then as you go up, it narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows,
and he's just bouncing back.
Yeah, and the water can get pretty hot.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, they. I looked it up. They say the first, one of the first signs of modern behavior, 164,000 years ago, they found that people were eating a dinner of oysters in a cave. They discovered remnants of modern behavior of a dinner of oysters. Which is crazy.
So who first decided to eat an oyster?
Right.
Because it's kind of gross.
They're probably desperate, right? They probably saw it and just
I know.
It back.
Yeah, if you're desperate enough, you'll eat anything. I know that some birds, like even around here, will pick up an oyster, fly way up, drop it on a rock.
Oh, that's. I thought they would just peck at it, but
no,
too hard on their beak, probably.
They'll pick up an oyster, fly up really high, drop it, land on a rock.
Smart.
Or like bar clams, stuff like that too. Any of those shelled animals, they'll do it to crabs. Drop it, kill it. Plus, it'll open up because oysters are very hard to open, right? Yeah. Once the shell cracks, well, they can get their beak in there.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's full-time shuckers.
Yeah.
Oyster shuckers. Yeah. Is that difficult? I've never had an oyster. I've never even seen an oyster in person before.
Well, you'll see some this summer. It's not. Yeah, it's a challenge. Like I see those guys, so I can open an oyster and I can get it open without getting a bunch of junk into the oyster. Because when you break the oyster open, you can get a bunch of shell in it, right? And what I don't understand about the professional shuckers is that they can go in all in one swift motion. Go in, cut the mussel, pop it off, recut the mussel and set it down in like seconds.
And they're cutting the mussel in half?
No, well, when I
Or-
say muscle is there's meat in there, and then there's a muscle that attaches to the bottom shell and the top shell,
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
and that's how they open and close.
It almost looks like kind of like a yolk inside an egg, kind of,
Sort of,
in a sense.
sort of.
Okay.
And so they have to pop it open, and then you have to feel on the top. You have to cut the top muscle, and then throw the top shell away.
Yeah.
And then you have to cut the bottom muscle so that when you go to slurp it,
It's all one
it
piece.
falls out.
Yeah.
And like I can, if I'm getting oysters ready,
You like oysters?
yeah, cooked, they're really good.
Oh, cooked.
And raw, they're pretty good.
Is that common cooked? I thought it was always raw.
No,
I literally thought
No.
it was always just like liquid. Just
no,
suck it
you
back
can
like a
cook
booger.
them. You can cook them in the half shell. So I'll open them and put them in muffin tins, and then put a bit
Cool.
of garlic powder because
with the shell or no shell?
in the cup,
In the cup, yeah.
not the top
bottom
shell.
half, yeah.
The bottom half. So it holds the juice because that's part of the quality aspect of oysters that it holds the juice in because the flavor's in the juice.
Yeah.
Right. Like salt water, but when you cook it, the flavor goes through it, and you put a little bit of Tabasco sauce, cheese, garlic powder, cook it in the half shell, and it's really good. And that's how I break people in.
Oh, really?
Right. That's how I get people used to it.
Give them a good
And
taste.
and but like in the run of a half hour, maybe if I'm opening steady, I can open 70 to 80 oysters. That's not very fast. But those guys, those professional shuckers, like they could likely do that in 10 minutes.
Wow.
And end up with,
Do they have a special knife? What do they
I don't know. I don't think,
because it almost seems like it needs to have a curve to it to be able to be like kind of thing. I don't know.
I don't know how I've never really watched the professionals do it. Like here at the Rock the Boat, there's a festival here, like they have competitions and stuff, and you see the numbers that people did. It's like, wow, but I've never watched them.
Right.
But one of the slickest ways to eat oysters, if you're desperate and you don't want to open them, if you put a bit of water in like a steamer, like for steaming vegetables, put a bunch of oysters in there, steam them for a few minutes, and then set it aside. And they'll all, once you steam them, you'll kill them, and they'll all open. And then once they're open, you just cut the muscles and just take all the meat and throw it in batter and deep fry them. It's like bar clams, except better.
Okay.
Like bar clams are chewy and tough.
Yeah.
Oysters, not tough.
Like tender.
Tender. So they taste like bar clams, except not chewy.
Wow.
But if you're buying your own oysters, that's kind of expensive.
Is it similar to like a scallop?
No.
Or not really.
No, not at all. Because a scallop, you only eat the muscle.
Cooked wise, I guess is what I was thinking. But
No, not really, because a muscle, a scallop, you're eating just the muscle. You're not a scallop. You're discarding the shell, obviously, and you're discarding all the meat, and you're just eating that muscle. But an oyster has two smaller muscles, so that if you broke the muscle apart and just ate the muscle, it kind of tastes like a scallop.
oh, okay.
But
Yeah.
not really. Anyway,
Some big threats to oysters, like environment wise. Like sounds like they can pretty much withstand a lot of things, but
there's some diseases out there that has wreaked havoc on different locations, and then takes years for it to come back, but does eventually, because like natural immunity sets in, and
like
that's always
bacteria,
scary.
disease
Yeah,
type?
there's like a bacteria type thing called MSX in the Nova Scotia that killed off their industry completely in Cape Breton,
Wow.
like in the 90s,
Like
I
spread
think.
like wildfire type.
Yeah,
thing?
but then it's coming back now, but
Oh.
it took a long time. Here,
They don't know the source of it.
no, they still don't know what carries that. Like, so they
Gotta be
don't
some
know,
type of sea creature.
but they don't know what brings this like They claim you can take an MSX oyster that it has the disease, put him in a tank with one that doesn't have it, and the one that doesn't have it won't get it. But yet, when it hit in those areas, everything died.
Oh, okay.
So what was the transmitter? Like, what was the carrier? They don't know. So that's kind of scary for us, right? Because that Cape Breton's pretty close,
Right.
but it's never traveled over across the Surrey.
Does the water go that way or down?
Both ways, right, with the tide.
True.
Because the water comes right up,
Yeah.
like the Northumberland Strait. But the biggest threat we would have is storms. Like Dorian devastated us quite a bit. Like,
Yeah.
it was pretty bad. And then Fiona, we sunk everything before Fiona. We just pulled the covers on everything and let everything go down.
Oh, okay.
Because of how much damage Dorian did, it terrified us about. Because of Dorian, it made us realize how bad it could be, right?
Podcasting.
Because of Dorian, made us realize how bad it could be. And Fiona was a lot worse storm than Dorian.
Mm-hmm.
Dorian was in 2019, but we didn't take any chances. Like, Dorian was a really good lesson. Like, it can be bad, and we just sunk everything to the bottom for Fiona.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to rock them up a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking for time here because we have a birthday supper to go to. Last question. I wrote down. Well, I wrote down different equipment, but I just want you. I'm kind of more interested in this, like to reproduce oysters. Do you know how they recreate? And different species. That's kind of what I want.
Species.
Different species
of oysters.
Yeah.
There's different species of oysters, but not. It's like Vancouver area, like the Pacific coast has their own type. Like the Asian countries, like China grows some of their like a different species, and there's all these different. But it's not like within PEI. There's multiple species of oysters.
Yeah.
Like they're all the same.
Oh, okay.
PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia.
I think I read.
And
something.
down the eastern seaboard as well. I believe they're all the same species, but they grow different because of their environment. I think.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
I think I read something that they like the male and female of oysters, like they like reverse roles.
Yeah, they can.
Constantly.
So based on it's freaky. It's weird because the oyster, like one oyster that's male will release sperm, the other one will release eggs, and that'll mix in the water column. But somehow they claim that every bay will roughly balance itself on males and females. Because if there's way too much sperm, it's not good. If there's and somehow they'll balance each other out by some switching genders. And it doesn't make any sense because how would they know what is needed?
Well, it wouldn't be a gender thing to them.
No, correct.
But it is weird that they literally transition their producing
like
system or reproduction.
biology,
right?
Yeah.
But there just must be a switch or something that they know. All right, I'm getting fed too much of this.
Yeah.
I need to be able to pull this in somehow, and they can turn a vice.
It's an odd concept that, like, how do they know what is needed? But
very interesting.
Anyway.
Anyways, we got to cut it short because we're on a time crunch. I wish I could keep talking to you about anything and everything, but I think that's all we have.
That was boring all about oysters, but I do apologize.
I think people can learn. So that's all that matters. But yeah, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Mitchell.
Go check out Michael. You don't really have any socials that you need to plug, eh?
No.
Okay. But we'll be on the water, and I'm really excited. Anyways, thank you guys for listening, and that's everything.